Is this okay like this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Thanks everyone for coming. I'm really excited to be here. I'm having lots of fun. I don't want to go home.
Stay, you're welcome.
Yeah. So many people keep saying that to me. And yeah, I wish I'd extended my trip because it's been so busy. I haven't had much time to explore more than like the inside of pubs. So first, I do want to thank you all for coming, of course, again, and thank ForWomen Scotland for organizing this and for all of their incredible work. I'm very impressed. I'm really impressed actually by all of the women here in the UK. There's so many different groups, there's different websites, there's so many women who are using all sorts of incredibly creative and effective tactics to push back against gender identity ideology and legislation. And we haven't seen that in Canada at all. So I hope that, and I have been advocating for this in Canada for some time now, that Canada look towards what's going on in the UK, because right from the get-go, you all organized and decided to do something instead of sit back and be fearful or be, or complain online, which I understand. I complain online all the time. I'm not disagreeing. And I totally understand why women are fearful, but at the same time, it almost feels like a lost cause in Canada right now, and that's because nobody stood up. Few people did in any case. The Canadian media has all but ignored feminist voices on this issue. They've intentionally pretended that the gender identity debate is left versus right, aka good versus bad. I'm not saying that binary is true. I don't think that there is a very clear left-right binary. Actually, I think most people exist somewhere in the middle. But they pretended as though the feminist critique doesn't exist. They pretended as though women didn't have concerns. They pretended as though the general public doesn't have concerns. It's dishonest. It's unconscionable. In essence, journalists in Canada have refused to do their jobs and are intentionally creating a false narrative, either out of bias or cowardice. When we held the first ever event discussing the issue of gender identity and women's rights in Canada at the Vancouver Public Library in January, the media refused to cover it until protesters began harassing the library to cancel the event, naturally. And the CBC, which is our national public broadcaster, held a radio panel about our event, like maybe a week before the event happened. They didn't invite me on the panel, or any of the organizers. Instead, they invited a local trans activist and I think like a free speech lawyer, and they all sat around and discussed what I might say at the event and whether or not it might be hate speech. No, they couldn't think of a way to find out what it is I actually think, I guess. And I've been on the CBC before, and I've been on the show where they were discussing this, so it's not like they don't have my contact info. And the CBC is actually right across the street from the library, but they decided not to show up for the event. The event was only covered by a few mainstream outlets in Canada, again, only as a result of the threats of protest, so they didn't even really cover the event for the most part. They just covered the fact that a transphobic speaker was coming, or an anti-trans speaker, and acted as though the detractors were the story rather than the actual story, which was the conversation and our concerns about the law. Our most recent event, which addressed the issue of trans kids, featured a panel including myself, an extremely articulate and bright young detransitioner named Dagny, and Dr. Ken Zucker, who ran the Gender Identity Clinic in Toronto for over 2 decades before being fired as a result of a smear campaign by trans activists. That event was attended by 260 people and protested by somewhere between 150 and 200 trans activists. We sent out a press release to every media outlet we could think of, and nobody showed up or covered it at all. The UK, of course, has been an entirely different story, and numerous outlets are doing really good, I think, ongoing, fair coverage of this debate and treating women's concerns seriously. So I do think that it's important we acknowledge that and appreciate that, and also use that to push North America to do better. One of the things that I've started to do during these talks is to start by defining my terms, and this is because, and I think this is an intentional tactic, people who advocate gender identity ideology and legislation refuse to define their terms in clear and coherent ways, which makes genuine conversation and debate impossible. Without clear definitions, words mean nothing and communication goes nowhere. Orwell, of course, warned us about the destruction of language, and we're seeing this happening now through trans activism. We're being prevented from speaking the truth, from thinking critically and honestly, and from communicating material reality, as words are redefined or simply rendered meaningless. So, when I say sex, I'm referring to biology, whether an individual is male or female. I define man as an adult male human, and a woman as an adult female human, which is a very hateful thing to say. Shocking. When I say gender, what I mean is the stereotypes and social roles imposed on males and females based on their sex. So this is what I mean when I talk about femininity and masculinity. So the ideas we hold in society about what men and women should be. What social norms we're expected to adhere to, how we should dress, how we should act, what our personality traits should consist of, what we should like, what kinds of jobs we should have, etc. When I say trans activist, I'm not specifically or necessarily talking about trans-identified people, I'm just talking about people who advocate gender identity, ideology, and legislation. Trans-identified people are not a monolith, and I know people who identify as trans. Most of these people would identify as transsexual, probably as opposed to transgender, but who are critical of trans activism and gender identity, ideology, legislation, etc. Those people are always ignored, pushed aside. Trans activists like to pretend that they don't exist. When I say gender identity ideology or transgender ideology, I'm referring to the idea that it's possible for a person to be born in the wrong body, or that it's possible for a person to change sex. When I talk about gender identity legislation, I'm referring to legislation and policies that allow people to self-identify as any sex they like, and to access facilities, spaces, political positions, jobs, grants, universities, sports competitions, etc. on that basis. I do not use the term cis. In case you haven't heard of it before, it's a word created. I guess you guys all have heard of it. Anyone doesn't know. It's a word created by trans activists to refer to people whose gender identity matches their sex. And the reason, I need a man up here. This is because I don't have a gender identity, and in fact, I don't believe that anyone does. We all have bodies and we all have personalities, and my personality is not a set of stereotypes. So I refuse to identify myself with a set of stereotypes that have been used to defend sexist practices and beliefs throughout history. I am also not a biological essentialist. Biological essentialism, we're often accused of that. These people don't have dictionaries or something. They accuse us of all sorts of things that they're actually doing. Biological essentialism is the idea that an individual's personality is an innate or natural essence, and that's attached to their sex. Feminists don't make that argument. I believe that males and females can have all kinds of personalities. I think that boys and girls should be allowed to play with whatever toys they like and wear whatever clothes they like, regardless of whether or not those clothes and toys are designated for girls or for boys. When I was little, I wanted to play with trucks, and it turns out I'm still female after all. I don't believe that females are all inherently passive, irrational, emotional, and drawn to makeup and stilettos. I don't believe that all males are inherently unemotional, rational, and aggressive and drawn to sports and trucks. I want people to be themselves and be free to live their lives in ways that feel authentic and fulfilling to them. I don't believe any person should be discriminated against or harassed because they step outside gender stereotypes. And as a feminist, I think that we should encourage people to step out of gender stereotypes. This also means that I don't believe that because, for example, a boy likes pink and wants to play with dolls, that this means he's not male, but actually female. I think this is an incredibly regressive, sexist, and irrational point of view. I don't think that boys are limited to the narrow confines of masculinity, and I don't think that girls are limited to the narrow confines of femininity as we understand those ideas today in our current society. This has always been what feminism has advocated. So one of the reasons I challenge gender identity ideology is because I think it's regressive, sexist, and nonsensical. I think it limits us rather than allowing us a full range of options as human beings with diverse interests and personality traits. But I also think it has incredibly negative impacts on women's rights in particular. And I think that it's important that when enacting legislation and making sweeping changes to policies that impact women and girls, we should be having a conversation about it at least and engaging in rigorous public debate. Women have specific rights based on the history and reality of sex-based oppression. We also have specific sex-segregated spaces based on the understanding that men pose a threat to women. Not all men, but only men. You know, women don't live in fear of other women, they live in fear of men. Female firefighters had to fight in order to have access to their own locker rooms and facilities because they were being subjected to sexual harassment and sexual assault in the shared spaces. They only won this fight recently in Canada. Feminists built and funded transition houses for women escaping male violence. They built them from the ground up during the second wave. They volunteered to keep those spaces running. They funded them themselves. They fought to keep them open so that women would have somewhere to go if they were being abused or if they were victimized. And now we're being told this is discriminatory. That having spaces for women to protect them from male violence is bigoted. We're told that to give women and girls the opportunity to play sports, to compete on fair ground, meaning to compete among and against other females, is not inclusive. That true progress demands female athletes must compete against men, essentially rendering women's sports non-existent. Over and over again, I ask those who insist that trans women are women what the word woman means. They refuse to answer, or they simply say it's a person who identifies as a woman, which is not how definitions work. But I mean, what that essentially means is that it's nothing, or it's anything. And it's crazy making, and it's defining women out of existence, or undefining them out of existence, I guess. On what basis do women's rights exist if the word woman is meaningless? If anyone can identify in and out of femaleness on a whim. Males and females are physically different, and this world has been built based on the idea of the male as the norm. So this means that cars have traditionally been designed for male bodies. Office temperatures are set based on what's comfortable for the male body, which is why we're always cold. Studies done on how certain pharmaceutical drugs impact people have been conducted primarily on men, not on women. Women die from heart attacks more often than men, and this is because women's heart attack symptoms are different than men's, so we don't recognize when a woman's having a heart attack. Men have more muscle mass, longer limbs, bigger organs, and different bones than women. Their pelvises, spines, and feet are different. They move their bodies differently. This all has a notable impact, of course, on athletic ability, among other things. And none of this can be altered substantially through surgery or hormone treatments. Decreasing testosterone does not change the physical body of a male to such an extent that it becomes a female body. So when, for example, we're talking about things like health and women's sport, it actually is incredibly important to differentiate between male and female bodies. Your doctor can't treat you effectively if she or he does not know what your sex is. And of course, your doctor does know what your sex is, regardless of how you identify. All of your doctors are TERFs. If we do want to maintain women's rights and protect women's spaces, we can't separate women from femaleness. And it's totally unnecessary to do so. It's irrational and it's dangerous. It makes women and girls vulnerable. And beyond that, there's no reason why we can't protect the rights of individuals to step outside gender roles and to express themselves as they like, and also understand that sexual dimorphism is real and that males and females exist and that those differences matter. What is incredibly ironic about this debate, and the way feminists who challenge transgender ideology are positioned, is that feminists are always the ones who have argued against the so-called gender binary, as the queer activists would call it. So the idea, again, that men have to be masculine and only masculine, and females have to be feminine and only feminine. We want people to be free to be themselves and not to feel pressured to adopt masculine or feminine stereotypes. Yet, we're the ones in this debate accused of being conservative or regressive or not allowing people to be who they really are. And this is coming from people who say that any boy who likes frilly pink dresses cannot possibly just be a boy who likes frilly pink dresses, but must really be a girl, and that a girl, for example, who doesn't want to wear dresses or be sexualized must actually be a boy. Today, we're all told that if we don't accept the notion that biological sex is determined by an individual's personal feelings, preferences, or desires, we're bigoted or fascist, or even that we deserve to be killed. Countless people, mostly men, have sent violent threats to me for saying what I'm saying today. Vancouver's very progressive mayor called me despicable on the news for speaking at an event about women's rights and gender identity. He had no idea what my position was, and he said this despite the fact that my safety and my life was being threatened for doing so. You didn't condemn these threats. People have accused me of hate speech and even hate crimes because I say that males and females are real, that women's rights and spaces should be protected, and that women and girls have the right to have boundaries, and because I ask questions about terms like transgender and about the implications of legislation rooted in this nonsensical regressive ideology. We still don't know what a trans person is. We don't know what makes a male actually a woman. Surgery, hormones, clothes, makeup, long hair. There's no coherent definition. It could be anything or anyone. It's nothing more than a statement and it's unverifiable. And to create legislation around something completely vague and undefinable seems odd to me, if not dangerous. So according to Justice Canada, the Ontario Human Rights Code, gender identity is defined as a person's internal or individual experience of their gender. I'm glad you guys find that funny. Because of course, how a person experiences or feels about or analyzes gender and gender roles does not literally change their sex. I'm told that saying these things hurts people's feelings and that therefore I may not say them. But I don't care. Which is not to say that I don't care about feelings. I have lots of feelings. But I just, again, I find it really ironic because I think if we're going to talk about feelings, then, you know, you have to ask why it is that women's feelings are being ignored in all of this.
Yeah.
And why the feelings of women and girls who might have to share a change room with a naked man why those feelings don't matter. The feelings of girls who, or the feelings of women who've been victimized by men and don't want to share a room in a transition house with them. The feelings of women who are being made to compete against males in sports and losing opportunities as a result. In Toronto, a woman named Christy Hanna filed a human rights complaint against the Jean Tweed Centre, which runs Palmerston House, a shelter for female recovering addicts, after she was told she had to share a room with a man claiming to be a woman. She told me that this man looked like a man and talked like a man and had a beard and was wearing big combat boots. He hadn't had any sex change surgeries, but of course he was admitted anyway, because we have to respect this new legislation, this new ideology. When she and some other women complained to the staff about his presence, the response was, "We're inclusive." This to a woman who's been sexually assaulted multiple times, who suffers from PTSD and insomnia, on top of course, struggling with substance abuse issues, and who felt so triggered and unsafe upon this man's arrival and placement in a room that she had to leave her room and go stay somewhere else because she was so stressed out she couldn't sleep. And I sort of wonder why these trans activists who care so much about empathy and feelings don't have any empathy for her or care at all about her. In March, Vancouver City Councillors voted to cut funding to Canada's longest-standing rape crisis centre and transition house. This happened after a number of local activists, namely BC NDP, the NDP is our leftist party, or like Labour Party essentially, BC NDP Vice President Morgan Auger complained. This guy is international. Every time I say his name, he's famous. He complained that the organization didn't allow men to train to become counselors at the transition house. He didn't say men, but he was talking about men. Or house male victims of violence. And this, all for the record, is well within their rights. Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter won the right to determine their own membership and who they serve at both the provincial Supreme Court and at the federal level in 2007. All oppressed groups have this right in Canada. So Morgan Auger has attempted to claim over and over again that what groups like Vancouver Rape Relief are doing is against the law. But not only is he wrong, specifically about rape relief, but if what he was saying were true, it would mean that services specifically, say, for like Indigenous single mothers or even trans-identified people were similarly guilty of discrimination. The efforts to take away funding from an organization like Vancouver Rape Relief are an explicit attack on feminists who understand that being born female in this world means something. It isn't just an outfit you put on and take off. It means you're treated a particular way in this world and that you're particularly vulnerable in particular situations. This is why they believe, and I would assume anyone who has any empathy towards female victims would understand this as well, that women need spaces to escape and heal from male violence that are free from men. What about the feelings of the women who will no longer have safe spaces to go to escape abuse if these places are defunded for maintaining women-only policies? What about the feelings of women who are scared for their jobs and their lives just because they want to discuss or ask questions about the implications of gender identity, ideology, and legislation? What about the feelings of the 14 female estheticians who were asked to give a male a Brazilian good class and then dragged to court when they declined, saying they had offered the service to women? None of this is about transphobia. It's about women having the right to say no to men. Yeah. To not be gaslighted, and bullied for daring to consider their own safety, rights, and feelings first. To speak, to tell the truth, to name reality, and to maintain sex-based rights. In Canada, we're not only allowing men to dictate what a woman is, but to destroy hard fought-for rights won by feminists, very quickly without any public debate. We're putting women and girls in danger in order to avoid offending the feelings of a tiny minority of people. Again, without any public debate. We're allowing women to be fired, harassed, smeared, silenced, intimidated, ostracized, even beaten in some cases in order to accommodate the feelings of men. And I refuse to accept or repeat lies under threat, especially lies that are We can support people's rights and dignity and provide them with the services they need without lying and without throwing women under the bus.
Yeah.
There is no need for women's rights if women don't exist. And if the source of their oppression is not their sex, but their feelings about femininity. No matter how a woman feels about gender, she will still experience this world as female. Those who are speaking out about and asking questions about gender identity are not doing so to be cruel. They're not doing so because they're hateful. They're doing so because they have real, genuine concerns that deserve to be taken seriously and addressed. So, thank you again for coming here. Thank you for pushing back in the face of extreme backlash. And thank you for making very clear that women matter, that women's voices matter, and that the truth matters.